We'll just wait for Melanie's audio to connect.
Sure.
Okay. Hey, aloha kakayaka kako. Good morning, everyone. We have this morning Daniel Holden from Second Language Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa to present on Second Language Program Administrators, Critical Values and Practices. So join me in welcoming Daniel. Dan, mahalo.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for allowing me to present today. I'll share my screen. Okay, and can you see just the slideshow? Looks good? Okay, great. So yes, as we said, this topic is Second Language Program Administrators. And actually, I just think I'd start with telling you a little bit about myself. So actually, I'm not currently an administrator. I'm a PhD student at the Second Language Studies Department. And I've actually been an English language teacher for the past 12 years. So I would say that my primary passion or my main focus is in teaching. And of course, that fits the kind of HALT mission, I think. But I've gotten really interested in the work of administrators as I've gone through my MA and my PhD, and I've been thinking more about what they do and how that might affect students and teachers in their daily work, right? So in addition to that, I've also gotten really passionate about critical pedagogy as well. And I've been trying to think more about how that will impact administrators' work as well. So I'll tell you a little bit about our talk today. We're going to start with a bit of an opening discussion, and then we'll go into my personal motivation and background for conducting this study. And then we'll discuss the literature review, of course. And in this case, we're going to be looking at a bit about critical pedagogy in general, and then we'll also be looking at what it means to be a critical administrator in this context. Of course, I'll go over the methodology of my project, and then we're going to be looking at 3 phases of pilot data. So we have survey, interview, and observational data, and then we'll wrap up with some discussion and final thoughts. Okay, so to get started, I thought it'd be good just for us we can either throw something in the chat or you can unmute and give me some ideas, but I just wanted to ask the group, what do you think are some typical challenges that are associated with being either an administrator or in a leadership position?
How about misaligned epistemologies?
Wow. Okay. Thank you, Alohi. Yeah, that's great. Right. So something the misalignment or the misunderstanding, perhaps, of what expectations are in this case. This epistemologies may maybe not be working in this case. Yeah, absolutely. Right. And then if you're thinking about like values themselves, of course, teachers display their values all the time. We also have students that are displaying values. But I'm thinking, what values do you think might be imperative if you're taking on an administrative role? And I just wonder if anybody has some ideas. What do you think kind of values administrators might need to have or should have?
And there's also responses in the chat. Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, not sure how to motivate. That's the issue, right? A sense of responsibility. Yeah, great. Exactly. Yeah. So today we'll be looking at some different values that might be associated with leadership and administrative roles. So this was just to kind of spark an opening discussion. So I'd like to talk a little bit about my interest in conducting this study, and it actually stems from something that happened in 2017. I don't know how much you're aware of this, but this was an issue that happened in Washington State. It was the Evergreen State College protests. It got a lot of national news because of this professor named Brett Weinstein. And in order to just kind of give a little bit of background about it, essentially what was happening is that there was this event on campus where only POC, people of color, students and teachers were supposed to attend. And this white male professor decided to hold his regular classes. So it started this peaceful protest, but it was a very loud protest, and the students were essentially asking for this professor to be fired, and it was a big deal because it had gotten so big. There's a lot to say about it. I'm really, really interested in this because what you can see on YouTube is the students filmed the whole day for this 3-day period. You can see administrators had filmed things on their phones. So there's a lot of data here. But for the purposes of this presentation, I want to focus mostly on this guy here. So the guy in the white shirt, his name is George Bridges, and he was the president of Evergreen State College at the time. And what I used to think when I was thinking about my training in terms of being a teacher, you used to think of things in a dichotomy, right? So there's good teachers and there's bad teachers. And what are some traits of good teachers? What are some traits of bad teachers? And I used to think of that in the same way with administrators too, right? What are some traits of good administrators? What are some traits of bad administrators? But what's interesting about this specific case is you have somebody who actually, surprisingly, aligned with the tenets of social justice. And so as an administrator, this George Bridges was actually saying to the students, I respect your right to protest. I want you to protest. You can see in this picture, the students are kind of crowding into his office, and they're asking him to do, actually they have demands for him to comply with, and he's doing his best to kind of work with them. So you have an administrator who, in his mind, is trying to do the work of social justice and comply with the demands of students. But at the same time, there's something to be said of what's happening in these moments. So I'd like to watch this clip, and it's a short clip, and it's one of the students that filmed actually him on their cell phone. So it's the quality's not so good, and you might not be able to hear everything, but I think just getting the atmosphere of the situation, and then we'll talk a little about what's going on. So let me go here. And let me just stop share for just a second. I want to make sure that I click the share sound and video clip. Okay. So I'm going to play the clip now.
This last year, we hired 14 new faculty members. Of those, 5
14? That's nothing to be.
That's who we hired.
What about the 5? Then 5 of the what?
5 of color, and then of the, which is...
That's not the majority. Why are you bragging like that's the majority?
I know, it's a higher percentage.
Can you watch your microaggression with your hands and your posture, please? Yeah. Put your hand down, George. Put your hand down. Put your hand down. Watch yourself. That's not appropriate.
Listen, good.
You gotta put your hands down. You know you gotta put your hands down.
Yes, Ike! Yes, Ike!
Okay. So what's happening in this clip? Basically what's happening is George Bridges is trying to explain to the students that he has been hiring more people of color for the faculty, and the students are not necessarily satisfied with the amount of people that are being hired. But what's interesting here is that he puts up his hand, and he's trying to orient to this idea of like, okay, well, I know it's not perfect, but I want to kind of explain it's a higher percentage. But you see the students are saying, can you watch your microaggressions with your hands and your posture? And as it continues on, they're essentially telling him like, don't point, you got to put your hands down. This is, affecting me, the fact that you're kind of letting us know that you're pointing at us and we don't like that, right? So it's interesting when you think about this administrator from the perspective of maybe trying to do good. He's also being ridiculed. He's not necessarily respected in this role. And as you watch more and more footage of this situation, you can see that even though he's doing his best to work with the students, he's still having a really difficult time getting things done in this kind of situation. So I've been thinking a lot about how administrators work with teachers, with students, and what values they have as they're working through decision-making, problem solving, and so on. So let's talk a little bit about critical pedagogy first. So I'll share again. Okay. Oh, actually, hold on. Okay. So as we think about critical pedagogy, of course, most teachers will bring up Freire. So I'll bring up 1998, and we'll talk a little bit about what we think about when we're just considering teachers and students. So the first thing that we often think about is that teachers are telling students they need to be acting as active agents, and the students themselves are able to talk with their teacher and think about validity, fairness, and authority. So in other words, that there's this constant dialogue happening between teachers and students, and that's always going to change depending on what the kind of situational context is, who the students are, what the teacher is willing to allow. But the important point is that there's this ongoing dialogue between the two, and that they're able to kind of come to some kind of compromise in the classroom, right? And then for critical pedagogy in general, again, we're thinking just from the teacher and student perspective. We often think of critical pedagogy as a liberatory process, right? And it happens throughout this kind of critical examination of what's happening in the space, power dynamics, how the students are feeling about particular issues, what the teacher is attempting to teach them. And it actually ultimately should be leading to some kind of action on the part of the students, whether that be changing some kind of policy or deciding on how much homework they need for this particular subject, right? So the form it takes can be big or small, but it depends on this ongoing dialogue between the two. And I really am interested in this idea of transformation because in theory, critical pedagogy, the teachers and the students are being transformed into critically thinking citizens because they're more concerned with the idea of what is this education doing for me in my life, in the real world. It's not just an isolated classroom where I'm learning something and I'm taking a test, for example, right? There's a bigger picture to it. And so we think about this idea of transformation. Now, when we think about administrators, obviously they have a different role to play in a school system, right? They have essentially they want to control certain aspects of the curriculum or the way that the school is run. They have to come up with some kind of consensus in order to make decisions. They have to make decisions often very quickly. So what do we think about when we consider this idea of like a critically minded or a social justice administrator? What do they do? Who are they, right? So there's a lot of different interpretations, and it's very tricky because different authors have different ideas about what this means, of course. For the sake of this presentation, I'm going to distill it down to 3 different interpretations. The first one is that a critically minded or a social justice oriented administrator could be thinking about leadership as a democratic process. So essentially, they value the idea of liberty, equality, and community. They can fall back on this idea of, okay, I am leading people through this kind of democracy. I'm listening to other people's ideas, and I'm ultimately making decisions, right? Or you might be seeing leadership as an ongoing process, which is a bit different. So in this case, the administrator is more willing to share power with other people, and they're looking for this more of a collaboration. And they're asking for real emotion as they're making decisions, like, how do you feel about this? And this can kind of change depending on the situation or the people that are involved, right? Or another interpretation is we can say that most recently, especially in the literature, especially in the kind of mainstream media, we see that leadership is often linked with identity and recognizing diversity. So this is how you see more of diversity statements in job applications, in mission statements. Who you are and what you represent is very important. It's not just about your ideas, but also your identity and that what you're bringing to the school in terms of your background and your either a background in terms of ethnicity or sexual orientation, or maybe socioeconomic background as well. Okay, so these are some possible interpretations of what a critically minded or a social justice administrator might be. And then we have to think about what are the responsibilities of administrators. So unlike teachers, who obviously their goal is to educate their students to the best of their ability, and they have time to do that because they control their curriculum, we often see that administrators are more action-oriented. They're reactive. I really like this quote from Carlin and Good. They talk about this idea that administrators often have to make decisions when they have incomplete information, and they have to do it with a sense of urgency because there are multiple things happening. There are distractions. They have to make these decisions often, either quickly or without a lot of input or feedback. So this is something a bit different from what teachers are usually doing. And then if we think about what administrators are asked to do on a regular basis, we could say that there's several different things, right? Maintaining relationships with staff and students, decision-making, problem solving, budgeting, marketing, networking, right? These are all things that they have to, all different kinds of hats that they have to wear. And in the case of second language program administrators, we also have to consider immigration laws, visa status, applying for federal grants in some cases, and then even finding alternative funding sources if they need some additional support, whether that be from private benefactors or other kinds of funding opportunities. So you have all this going on for the administrator, and if they still feel like they want to be critically minded or social justice oriented, let's think about what values could be associated with leadership in general. And this is a 2003, this is coming from a 2003 article, and I really like this a lot. This was actually a study conducted with Hong Kong high school principals, which seems very specific, but I really like what they got out of it. You can see here that they think of leadership values along a spectrum. And on one end, you have pacifism. And on the other end, you have confrontation. And then in the middle, you have this idea of consideration. And then they have kind of sub-values springing off from each one of them. But there was something that really surprised me about this way of conceptualizing values. And I wonder if anybody, particularly with the pacifism side and the confrontation side, and I wonder if anybody has anything that they see that's a bit surprising or interesting. You can either put it in the chat or maybe unmute. Well, I can share what I found, at least for me. So when you think about, if you view values, leadership values on the spectrum, what I noticed is that you would think, generally speaking, pacifism seems to be a good thing. And then on the other side, confrontation seems to be a bad thing. But at least for me, when I looked at this, I was thinking, oh yeah, I guess it makes sense that in order to have some kind of justice, you would have to have some kind of confrontation. So in this case, we can kind of conceptualize confrontation as not necessarily being good or bad, but just something that you might value. You're okay with being antagonistic. You're okay with saying, I don't like this, or I don't want to do this. And so you're looking for some kind of justice. And then on the other side, when you think about pacifism, I was surprised to see the word submission or toleration. And I was thinking about that, and I thought, oh, wow, that's true, right? Just because you're theoretically at peace, or you feel like there's some kind of harmony, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's satisfied or happy. It just means that you're trying to maintain this kind of peaceful, harmonious system. But in order to do that, some people might have to submit or be very tolerant of the things that are happening in the program. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then the authors also showed this chart of two kinds of leaders. So we have the non-participating leaders here, and then we have the participating leaders on the other end of the spectrum. And so from a non-participation standpoint, you would think, yeah, authoritarianism, maybe exclusion. But I also thought about this word control here. And I was thinking, yeah, that actually makes sense to me too, because just because you have control, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing something wrong or bad. It just means that you value this idea of like, I'm in this position, I'm going to make a decision, and I want to do X, Y, and Z, right? On the other side of it, you have this idea of mentoring or participatory leaders. And in this case, you have this idea of shared power, collaboration, democracy. So again, not not saying that anything is necessarily good or bad, it's just different, and it depends on the situation that the leader finds themselves in, or the administrator. Okay, so one more thing I'll share is kind of distilling some of these leadership styles into some clear labels. Obviously, you can disagree, but I think that this is useful for us in terms of conceptualizing administrators. So on one end, you might have the pacifists. And so these leaders tend to favor tolerance, submission, and harmony. And so you can either see that as good or bad. But in other words, they want to maintain this kind of peaceful status. They don't want to have too many confrontations in their school. They also value procrastination, which is interesting, right? So they don't really want to make these decisions because making a decision ultimately leads to unhappy people. And they don't necessarily welcome problems as growth opportunities. So these are kind of pacifist leaders. And then you have the progressive or the philosopher mentors. And so this is kind of in the middle. These kind of leaders would favor innovation. They might have high ethical principles themselves, so they have an idea of what ethics matter to them, and they would obviously share that with their staff and hope that they feel the same way. There is more of a sense of democracy, collaboration, and I thought this word compliance is interesting too, because it means that even though they're willing to collaborate and share the power, they also expect some return on this kind of, when they make a decision, they want this compliance, right? So they do welcome challenges. And then the third type is not the authoritarian, is not the person who just says, do whatever I say. It's the pragmatist. So the pragmatist leader is somebody that does think about consequences, but they might have more situational ethics. So that means that they're willing to compromise depending on what the situation is, depending on who's involved. And so they don't always carry the same ethics or morals throughout their life. It's more of a, what's the situation? Let's talk about it, and then we'll make a decision. So we have different types of leadership styles, again, based on this article. Okay, so now that finally brings us to, second language. So what does this mean for second language program administrators? Are they critical? Can they be critical? Well, we know that there are so many studies based on second language classroom teachers, of course. I'm just sharing just a very few here. And there's so much research on how critical pedagogy is conducted in the classroom. But we have very, very, very few empirical studies based on administrators themselves and the work that they do. So in order to address this gap, this project, this is part of my dissertation. I'm going to be looking at what second language program administrators do, and then what they say they do. So essentially, what do they say about themselves? How do they conceptualize themselves? And then we'll be looking at what they're doing actually in the workspace and seeing how those values match up with what they think they do and then what they actually do in these on-site conversations and actions. So if you want to know a bit about my research questions, again, these are kind of simplified, but essentially, do critically oriented second language program administrators implement their critical values in their professional spaces? So if they think that they're critical, how do they do that? And then on the other hand, how does this actually manifest in language? So this would be the language, second language component of the study, right? What do they actually say? And how does that affect people as they go through their daily or weekly responsibilities? So for the greater dissertation study, this is actually what I'm doing. I'm going to be looking for 30 participants. I've actually already started this, but I'm getting 30 participants from administrators around Oahu. And of those 30, I'm going to be conducting 10 interviews with administrators who have identified as orienting towards social justice or critical values. And then of those 10, I'm going to be selecting 3, hopefully from different sites. So I'm hoping to get one from a private language school, hoping to get one with a university affiliation, and then maybe one from a charter school. That's my goal for the study. But for today, we're actually going to be looking at data from my pilot study. So I have a focal participant, Luke, who is, of course, a pseudonym and currently a director or an administrator of an ESL program with a university affiliation. He has a lot of experience. And what I did was I conducted an interview last semester first to just get some initial fact-finding information. Then we did the online survey, and then I conducted a second interview to kind of follow up on what the survey responses were. And then I conducted 2 Zoom observations, an analysis, and then I conducted 1 on-site observation. And this all happened very recently. Interestingly enough, too, you can see the dates here. There's actually a bit of continuity between these meetings. It wasn't necessarily something I expected, but you'll see that when we look at the data more in detail. Okay, so let's look at the survey results first. Now, obviously, a survey, you're just gathering kind of basic information, but here are a few takeaways from the survey with Luke. The first one is that Luke mentioned that the school's mission statement was developed collaboratively for the current iteration of the school. But at that time, not all teachers were totally satisfied with the finalized direction of the program. For his problem-solving method, he tends to have staff meetings to discuss issues, or if the staff meeting isn't enough, he's willing to have these one-on-one meetings or follow-ups. And there's lots of evidence to show that he's trying new ideas, willing to support new ideas, and he himself is trying new ideas to work through his responsibilities as an administrator. And then for stated values, off the list that I gave, we have empathy, fairness, respect, sincerity, loyalty. And then he added some others as well. Integrity was one, joy, and then love for staff and students was another. Interestingly, though, this particular administrator didn't necessarily orient to social justice as the label of social justice, but we'll talk a bit more about that in just a minute. So this is coming out of the survey. So after looking at this data and thinking about what questions to ask, we had some pretty lengthy interviews. And obviously there's lots of data that we could talk about, but I'll just focus on a few things. So the first thing from the interview is that regarding the mission statement itself. Now, I'm actually particularly interested in school mission statements because I would think that a lot of teachers maybe don't even know what their school mission statement is. And they don't necessarily know especially if it's a private school, they might not know like where the mission statement came from or what the goals of the administration are. So I was interested in this idea of like, okay, well, when you distill the program down to its basic components, what would be the goals of teaching students in this space? And so in this case, Luke had mentioned that the mission statement process was actually very laborious in terms of coming up with this finalized version, because the idea of having this transformational learning, again, we come to this idea of transformation, is a unmitigated good thing, right? He really believes that students that are coming here should be having this transformative experience. And he has a very high goal, and I think that's good, of trying to be this kind of change maker in this society, in the sense that the students are not only receiving language education, but they're also changing themselves as they go through this program. And then additionally, he talked about how, in terms of the mission statement, he has a faith-oriented person. And so when he thinks about himself, he also wants that to be projected onto students as well, in the sense that he wants them to have this kind of life-changing experience as they go through the curriculum of the school. And of course, that's not necessarily true for every single student, but that's the goal. They are coming here, they're getting great education, and when they leave, they feel like they've not only learned language, but they're also learning how to orient themselves to society, learning how to be adults, and so on and so forth. And then when we think about his leadership strategy, he says that he's essentially a cheerleader, right? Very, very loyal to the program. He wants to say that the students should be treated, not only as students, but the staff need to be treated with respect and honesty about expectations. And he believes that by interacting in his role, he can kind of bring this sense of joy to students and staff, because he wants them to be having a better day through this interaction with him, which I think is quite interesting. And at the same time, he also is aware that this is something that this is part of his own value, right? So we have the sense that he wants people to like him. This is this kind of idea of spreading joy and also showing respect to students. It's kind of gravitating out of every interaction that he can have with the students and staff. And then because of that, he also feels that there's this sense of trust. So this idea of building trust in this community, in this space, and that allows him to also run ideas by staff and allowing this kind of trust to foster a more smooth decision-making process. And so he knows that, of course, in his role, he is the one that has to ultimately make the decision. But the idea here is that by treating people good, by working with them very closely, and by trusting their decision-making skills, he can make good decisions himself. And then the last thing here is values. Now, again, we can talk quite a bit about the values that were stated, but again, I'll just distill it down a little bit because we want to get to the observation data. But again, this idea of trust, right? I'm motivated to build trust first. If you have this sense of trust and respect people, it's a win-win. That's not just students and staff, that also can apply to outside, funders or relationships within the greater community. And he very specifically says that I'm impacting lives and I love my job, which is not necessarily something that a lot of people can say. So you have a very passionate administrator here. And then in terms of social justice, I did say that he didn't orient to the phrase social justice, but he believes in social justice in the sense that if you hold the values that we had kind of discussed earlier, empathy, respect, trust, these kind of values, you are essentially accomplishing social justice without necessarily having that label. So it's just a different conceptualization of what social justice means to him. Okay, so you might be thinking, that sounds good, but this is what Luke is saying, right? So he's essentially saying, I'm doing these things. So what could we say, takeaways from the interviews themselves? Well, we could say that Luke himself could be labeled as maybe a progressive or a philosopher mentor. He himself maintains high ethical principles. He always discusses major decisions with staff, and he's willing to try new ideas. And we also see that he strives to maintain this positive and collaborative atmosphere. And so we could kind of label him in this way, this kind of philosopher or progressive mentor based on the values that we looked at earlier. But at the same time, we could also look at some inferences here too. So this could be potentially something that's either good or bad, depending on your perception of values. But Luke is also working very long hours to accomplish these goals, and he doesn't necessarily have an off time. In addition, he really believes in the fact that teachers themselves should be paid, which is, of course, very important for teachers. That's great. But that also could come at the expense of maybe the school not necessarily having full funding for something. And that means that in that sense, he'll need to work harder in order to figure out how to adjust the budget for some of these teachers. So again, putting more burden on himself. And also, we talked about this idea of this positive atmosphere. So he himself would feel bothered if somebody dislikes him or dislikes the decisions that he makes. So again, we have this kind of personalization and how that might affect him in his day-to-day if he's dealing with people that say, well, I don't like the decision you made, or I dislike your style in this particular instance. So again, we're looking at things that Luke is saying, and you might think, okay, that's all well and good, but what's he actually doing in some of these meetings? So we're actually looking at this observation data from November. And in this particular situation, we have Luke and Margaret and Rinka. We have basically the core administrators at the school. And so in this meeting, they're talking about the finalizing a tentative syllabus for an upcoming program with University X. So University X is sending these undergraduate students to the school, and they're trying to figure out the finalized syllabus. In this case, Margaret was asked to draft a syllabus before the meeting. So there's a draft on the screen. And then Luke, in this case, has some time pressure. He's trying to send the syllabus that afternoon to University X. So if we look here, we have Luke, Margaret, and they're talking about the syllabus itself. And we can see that Luke is using the phrase, using the pronoun here, we. So he says, we will need to trim this back, right? We should do it right now. And in this sense, we can see the value of collaboration. So he understands that he's under time pressure, but he's willing to work with these other two administrators in this role and saying that we need to, yes, thank you. Yeah, 10 minutes left. I'll try to go a little bit faster here. But in the sense that he's saying like, all right, we are doing this together right now. We should be working on this collaborative kind of assignment. But he's also saying here that the hours are too high, right? The hours that they've allocated for the syllabus are too much. So in this case, we have Margaret, who is orienting to the value of compliance and fairness because she was originally tasked with this assignment. So she's saying, okay, well, let me recalculate this and then I'll get back to you later. So this idea of like, it's not necessarily Luke who's designating who should do this. Actually, he's kind of orienting to this idea of we're in this together at the moment, but we have the staff saying, okay, well, I can handle this because this is implicitly part of my duties. And it's fair because I originally did the draft. Later in the meeting, we can see that what's happening here is Margaret's having some problems with Zoom. And so there's some time taken away from the meeting because there's some discussion about how to actually share the screen. And we can see here that Margaret's orienting to this idea of like, oh, I'm apologizing, I'm sorry, it's taking too long. And there's this kind of pause in the meeting. And then we can see here that Luke makes this kind of joke, right? Oh, she has a cracked screen because I dropped her computer. And everybody laughs about it. So we have this kind of positive atmosphere that's happening in this meeting. So even though that they're under this time pressure, and even though that it's taking time away from the meeting to work on this kind of Zoom issue, there's still time to have this kind of positive atmosphere in the meeting. And everybody seems to be enjoying this time, even though they're trying to accomplish the meeting goals. Later on in the meeting, you can see that Rinka actually says, before they move on, she said, I was gonna say, I mean, are we recalculating and sending the syllabus as it is? Or are we going to cut back now? So again, this orientation to we as a collaborative team. And we can see here that there's sort of this shared power. It's not Luke necessarily dictating like you have to do this and you have to do this. It's more of a we space. And it's about fairness, right? So we don't want to send University X this half finished syllabus. We need to kind of finish this up, now. And then again, we can see Margaret orienting to this idea of fairness and saying, well, no, I'm going to calculate. I'm going to send it to you. You can take a look, right? So in this space, they feel comfortable kind of sharing power, delineating tasks, and working together more as a unit. And Margaret takes the initiative by saying, like, I can do this, and then I'll get back to you. So in the end, we see Luke saying, like, okay, yeah, I would just want to make sure that we agree on this. He's, again, orienting to this idea of collaboration and consensus. Before moving on to another point. Okay, I know I'm kind of crunched for time, so I'll just might skip this, but all I'll say about this is that in this particular instance, we have a teacher who is bringing up a concern about the University X students coming to the school. And basically the teacher is saying, like, I'm a little bit worried about expectations. And so in this case, again, we have Luke who's kind of making a joke, even in this instance, kind of creating a positive atmosphere. And you can also see that he uses empathy in order to relate to his staff. And so he says, as a teacher and as an instructor, he's empathizing with them. And then also he's using this phrase in an administrative standpoint. He's kind of giving this idea of like, I empathize with you as an instructor. I've been there too, but in my administrator role, I want to respectfully explain this is what we have to do. And I'm kind of expecting your compliance as a teacher. So we can see here that in the meeting with the higher level administrators, we see more of a sense of shared power. But when Luke is in this kind of bigger staff meeting with the instructors, it seems like these decisions have already been made. And he's explaining what's happening, but at the same time, he's saying, I'm kind of expecting, implicitly this compliance. And interestingly here too, in this meeting, we can see that Margaret actually says, there's a good thing. The good thing is it's only affecting the first period class. So again, we have Margaret kind of coming in and sharing the power even in this teacher meeting space. And we can see Luke again saying like, yeah, so it's only going to be listening, speaking. We have this kind of sense of shared power and fairness in the space. So, okay, I'm going to just jump ahead to the very end because I know I'm running out of time. But what I'd like to say is that essentially, what we can say is that we're actually seeing Luke essentially what he says that he does or what he believes that he does is coming out in these meetings. We can say that he's not necessarily orienting to social justice as a label or as a term, but we do see displays of Luke towards stated values if we label him in this kind of progressive or philosopher mentor way. So particularly we see empathy, we see fairness, we see respect, and also this kind of implicit compliance. And indirect ways too, we also see loyalty to the program, and we also see joy. There's a lot of jokes, a lot of positive atmosphere that are coming out in these meetings. And then we also see that it isn't necessarily always the same. It depends on who's in the meeting. When we see Luke in this meeting with the kind of closest staff members, we can see that he is hesitating to take action. He's using the pronoun we. He's asking for ideas. He's really thinking about like, okay, we three need to be thinking about like X, Y, and Z, and please help me to make this decision. But when he's in leading the staff meeting with the teachers, we can see more of a kind of leadership role where he's willing to display empathy for concerns and respect, but he's also expecting compliance. I understand that this situation is complicated or confusing, but I would like you to do X, Y, and Z. And we also see that Luke values creating a positive atmosphere whenever possible. It's happening in all of my data. You can see him making jokes. You can see him trying to create smiles on people's faces. So essentially what we see here is that in this sense, we have an administrator who is saying, I value these things, and we also see him actually doing it in the space. So with that, I do apologize for going over, but I'm open to hearing any questions or comments. And thank you very much.
Mahalo, Dan. You actually have 3 more minutes.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Does anybody have thoughts? Or Melanie says mahalo. Oh, thank you. Any questions or comments?
I can ask one question.
Sure.
So you mentioned that basically what he does aligns with what he says, like claims what he's thinking about. Did you find any cases where there are any misalignments? I don't believe it's 100% of the time, but like you presented evidence that you found. Are there any evidence that of misalignment?
I would think that there probably are, but would you mind maybe letting me know, like when you say misalignments, what do you mean in that sense? Like, could you give me an example? Like
what he does doesn't align with the values that he talks about.
I see. So I think that the tricky part when you're working with values is that it's pretty open to interpretation. So in the sense that, like, for example, if you say that he respects staff, or that he is saying that he believes in democratic values or that kind of thing, there are, of course, instances where the teachers don't really have a choice in what's happening in this particular instance, right? So I think that you more so see instances where you could say, well, that's not very democratic, or that's not very, he's not necessarily kind of asking for opinions from the group. But I would also say that depends, it's very situationally contextual, right? So I would say that in general, I would say there aren't very many misalignments, but I would also say that obviously there's going to be situations where maybe some staff members might not think this way about him, depending on how often they get their needs met in the program. So if you were to say something like, especially when you're thinking about positivity too, right? So if you say like, oh yeah, I'm always democratic, or I'm always empathetic, There's definitely instances where you can see this is happening in the data, but maybe not everybody agrees on what empathetic means in certain cases, or how much shared power is being used in certain situations. So I would say that generally speaking, I was surprised to see that there weren't very many misalignments, but I would also say that there's definitely different teachers or different staff members might have different opinions depending on their experiences with this administrator, right? So they might feel like, oh, I don't think he's empathetic enough, or I don't think that he's asking for my opinion enough. But generally speaking, no, I don't think so. It's interesting because what he says he does show up in the data. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Mahalo nui. Well, let's give our mahalo to Dan. Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining
Thank
us. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and session 2 will start in 10 minutes. Okay. Mahalo.
Thank you for monitoring.
Of course. See ya.
Yeah. No, I'll stay here for your presentation.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
This is Kapua. Aloha Kapua. Dan just presented in our session.
Oh, nice. Aloha.
Yeah.
He inspired me to inspire you to keep going with your studies, and how happy I'll be when I'm your chair. Hey.
No kalai ula.